Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. We have completed 25 lessons, and we're in rule number 4. We are actually in our 13th lesson in rule number 4, and this is lesson 26. Last week, we began class with looking at the idea that we see what we believe in, what we value. And we learned last week that our understanding of what is good can be elevated. It can become more sophisticated. And it is the role of religion to elevate it. Left to ourselves without religion, our idea of the good might be our physical gratification, our sexual gratification, our ego gratification. But under the tutelage, under the instruction of religion, our idea of the good is elevated and becomes something more lofty. And as a result, religion must have a dogmatic element. In other words, religion teaches us what is good and what is not good. Religion is the authority. This is necessary. Also, obedience to your religious values is necessary as a starting place for our pursuit of the good life. Also, we ended with the idea that obedience is not enough. It is only a beginning. However, you cannot even begin if you are not self-disciplined enough to obey your religious teaching. So, obedience is a necessary starting place for the pursuit of the good life. Now, we will continue with our new material. Hold on. Does that mean that what we see is dependent on our religious beliefs? Yes. And what we don't see as well. You might object, but I'm an atheist. No, you're not. And if you want to understand this, you could read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Perhaps the greatest novel ever written, in which the main character, Raskolnikov, decides to take his atheism with true seriousness, commits what he has rationalized as a benevolent murder, and pays the price. You're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions that most accurately reflect your deepest beliefs. Those that are implicit, embedded in your being, underneath your conscious apprehensions and articulable attitudes and surface-level self-knowledge. You can only find out what you actually believe, rather than what you think you believe, by watching how you act. You simply don't know what you believe before that. You are too complex to understand yourself. Let's go back to the beginning of this reading. Okay, does that mean, okay, so here we have our transition talking about dogma being a necessary tool to teach us what to believe and how to pursue it. So does that mean that what we see is dependent on our religious beliefs? We previously said that what we see is dependent on our values. We see what we want. We are searching for what we want to find and grasp. So everything is not much information in our peripheral vision, and in the focus is only what we value. But if we have religion informing our values, then now we can refine the statement to we see according to our religious beliefs what our religion tells us is valuable. Yes, that is correct. And what we don't see as well. So what we don't see is what we are blind to. Our religion informs our value for what we focus on and our lack of value for everything else that then becomes made invisible. You might object, but I'm an atheist. The objection, logically, is if I am an atheist, I do not have religious belief at all. Therefore, religion does not inform my values. That is the logical objection that he suggests. No, you're not an atheist. And if you want to understand this, you could read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I wonder how many of you have read Crime and Punishment. I read it when I was in college many years ago. Perhaps the greatest novel ever written, in which the main character, Raskolnikov, decides to take his atheism with true seriousness. To take it with true seriousness means to behave consistently with it, not just to mouth the words of atheism while living according to other doctrines, but to live his life consistently with the tenets of atheism. So, he is going to take his atheism with seriousness and commit what he has rationalized as a benevolent murder. Rationalized means to justify, to tell yourself that something is legitimate and good. So he is going to commit a murder, but he has in his head decided that this murder is a good, not an evil. It is a good partially because it is benevolent. So the person he is going to murder maybe has a miserable life, and it could be considered euthanasia. It could be considered doing her a favor, maybe. I don't know. So, he is an atheist, so the law, thou shalt not kill, which comes from God, does not apply to him. He goes and murders, and he pays the price. And it doesn't mean he gets caught and goes to jail or is hung, although I think that happens, it means he reaps the spiritual punishment, the spiritual consequences. Whether or not he is caught by the police, he is destroyed because he has broken an objective spiritual law. It doesn't matter if he believes in God. If the law exists outside of himself and he has broken it, he will reap the consequences. So, this example is to prove to us that we are not atheists. Remember, he said, "You say I am an atheist." No, you're not. In the first place, probably you are not acting like an atheist. For example, if you believe C.S. Lewis has an example of a man, fictional example, of a man who speaks in favor of communism and that private property does not exist. Everyone owns, shares everything. This is his speech, but in his private life, he would walk 10 miles rather than leave a small debt unpaid. So this is an example of a man whose speech is kind of atheistic, but his actions are thoroughly Christian and theistic. C.S. Lewis has another example of English soldiers and Englishmen in general during the war, World War II, who would speak loudly that death is too good for the enemy. But then they would give cigarettes and food to every German pilot who was shot down out of the Air Force and came to their door. So again, they're saying death is too good for him, but in their practice, they are generous and charitable. So you are probably not an atheist in your behavior. Your code of ethics is probably very informed by religion, even if you don't think you believe in God. Okay, you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions that most accurately reflect your deepest beliefs, those which are implicit, embedded in your being, underneath your conscious apprehensions and articulable attitudes and surface level self-knowledge. There is something that we say to explain faith to a new believer of Christianity. We tell an anecdote. We say, several people are sitting in a house, and a man runs in and says, "The roof is on fire. The house is on fire. Get out." And some of the people say, "I believe you. You're probably right. He's right." But they don't move. Others say, "It can't be true. It's not true. You're lying." But they run out of the house. So the question is, who believed him? The ones who said, I believe, but they did not hurry out? Or the ones who said, no, it cannot be true, I don't believe, but they left the house? Our actions show our belief, our true belief. There is another story, sort of similar, of a man who set up a wire across Niagara Falls, or maybe it was a rope across Niagara Falls. And he would walk across, and sometimes he would take a wheelbarrow across the rope. And all the crowds were amazed. And he said, do you believe I could take a person across in my wheelbarrow? And many people said, yes, yes, we believe. So he said, who wants to be the person to go across? And nobody wanted to. They said they believed that he could do it, but they did not believe enough to let themselves be the one in the wheelbarrow. So, our deep belief is revealed by our actions. You can only find out what you actually believe by watching how you act. Find out means discover, because we do not know. What you actually believe, not what you think you believe, but what is true, what you truly believe. By watching how you act. So you must observe your own actions to discover what you yourself believe. You simply don't know what you believe before that, meaning before you have watched yourself and observed your behavior. You are too complex to understand yourself. Human beings are incredibly complex. Let us move on. It takes careful observation and education and reflection and communication with others just to scratch the surface of your beliefs. Everything you value is a product of unimaginably lengthy developmental processes, personal, cultural, and biological. You don't understand how what you want, and therefore what you see, is conditioned by the immense, abysmal, profound past. You simply don't understand how every neural circuit through which you peer at the world has been shaped, and painfully, by the ethical aims of millions of years of human ancestors and all of the life that was lived for the billions of years before that. It takes careful observation and education and reflection and communication with others. Okay, so careful observation does not happen by accident. You must give attention to looking at your own behavior carefully. And you must have education. We learn all kinds of things, like from psychology and from anthropology, and you must be an educated person. And reflection. Reflection is deep thought over time. Meditation. So it requires careful observation by an educated person who also spends time thinking deeply and meditating about it. And communication with others. So you can't just look at yourself. You must have the input of other people to give you perspective in order to just scratch the surface of your beliefs. Scratch the surface means to understand a small part of the most obvious layers. So it takes all of this observation, education, reflection, and communication with others, just, that minimizes, remember, just to scratch the surface, which also is a minimal. By doing all this, you are not plumbing the depths. You are just getting the barest minimum idea of what you really believe, of the foundations of your own beliefs. Everything you value is a product of unimaginably lengthy developmental processes. Everything you value is a product. Now, what he is saying is everything we value is produced by our culture going way back. We come from a Christian culture, which goes back thousands of years, 2,000 years. And even before that, in his mind, human evolution comes from animal evolution, which goes back even further to, which is being conditioned by what enables you to survive. And the good is that which enables you to survive and reproduce. So unimaginable lengths of time, all the way back to the beginning of life on Earth. That's what he is talking about. I myself, when I read this, when he said, everything you value is a product of unimaginably lengthy developmental processes, it made me think about the difference between what is valued by the political left and what is valued by the political right in America. Now, on the surface, the political left and the political right are diametrically opposed. They seem to hate everything the other values, and they consider each other to be evil. The left is valuing the downtrodden groups, the intersectional oppressed groups, women and people with unusual sexual identity and ethnic minorities and illegal aliens and prisoners and etc., etc. They champion these kinds of people, supposedly. Whereas, supposedly, the right believes in individual freedoms and individual responsibility and justice in that sense. And I often wonder why the people on the left champion the causes they champion. And I think it is the product of complex processes of education and of information. It's the result of being exposed to viewpoints that are being fed exclusively to people who listen to left-wing thought versus right-wing thought. And if you go a little deeper, not much, you find that both, in America, both the left and the right actually value the same things. The people on the right do value the human dignity of all of those oppressed peoples. And the people on the left do value objective justice, like punishing wrongdoers and such like that. We just don't recognize in the other party that the other party is valuing these things. So we have a different way to approach achieving our end our common end of a just society. That is assuming that the left is not simply and hypocritically using these pretended values to grab power, and assuming that on the right they are not pretending to care about individual rights as a way of maintaining power. Anyway, I was thinking all this. Let us go back to Jordan. Everything you value is a product of unimaginably lengthy developmental processes, personal, cultural, and biological. So personal would be your education and the philosophies you are exposed to and the beliefs of your parents and the way they raised you. Cultural, well, here we are in the United States and America with our cultural tradition of democracy and freedom and republicanism and all that. And then biologically, this is what Jordan Peterson thinks with the evolutionary question. You don't understand how what you want, and therefore what you see, this is our previous point, you can only see what you want, is conditioned by the immense, abysmal, and profound past. This is the one that goes all the way back to the origin of life. I love the word abysmal. Abyss. It's an unimaginably deep pit or chasm or well into which you could drop a stone and listen for a long time. And C.S. Lewis describes God as the abyss of the Father, in whom you may drop your thoughts forever and never hear the least echo of return. So I love that word. Usually abysmal means really bad, like really bad. But in this case, it simply means really deep and immense and profound. You simply don't understand. So before he said you don't understand, now he says you simply don't understand. It's emphasizing that this is true and that's just the way it is. You cannot possibly understand how every neural circuit through which you peer is this. So every neural circuit that facilitates your perception has been shaped by the ethical aims of millions of years of human ancestors, has been shaped painfully. Think about all the terrible things in history through which heroes have risen, and their heroism has been applauded in stories and tales, thus shaping us. So, by the ethical aims of millions of years of human ancestors and all of the life that was lived for the billions of years before that. This is the evolutionary stuff. You don't understand anything. This is a way of saying you understand so little that it may as well be nothing. And you didn't even know that you were blind. The smallest, easiest thing to know, the knowledge that you are blind. You didn't have that knowledge. Therefore, you don't understand anything. Some of our knowledge of our beliefs has been documented. Okay, so some of our knowledge of our beliefs, so that would be about our beliefs. So we know what people believe a little bit. It has been documented, like people have done studies and written books to figure out and explain the beliefs of people. Some of it. We have been watching ourselves act, reflecting on that watching, and telling stories distilled through that reflection for tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. That is all part of our attempts, individual and collective, to discover and articulate what it is that we believe. Part of the knowledge so generated is what is encapsulated in the fundamental teachings of our cultures. In ancient writings such as the Tao Te Ching, or the aforementioned Vedic scriptures, or the biblical stories. The Bible is, for better or worse, the foundational document of Western civilization, of Western values, Western morality, and Western conceptions of good and evil. It is the product of processes that remain fundamentally beyond our comprehension. The Bible is a library composed of many books, each written and edited by many people. It is a truly emergent document, a selected, sequenced, and finally coherent story written by no one and everyone over many thousands of years. The Bible has been thrown up out of the deep by the collective human imagination, which is itself a product of unimaginable forces operating over unfathomable spans of time. Its careful, respectful study can reveal things to us about what we believe and how we do and should act that can be discovered in almost no other manner. Okay, we have been watching ourselves act, reflecting on that watching, and telling stories distilled through that reflection for tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, so when he said before that some of the knowledge is documented, he was not only talking, as I said, about social studies and books written about human beliefs. He was actually talking about the books like the Tao Te Ching and the Bible and the Vedic scriptures, these very unique books. When I say unique, I mean very unusual books that are created by the collective in certain cultures over time. So, that is all part of our attempts, individual and collective, to discover and articulate what it is we believe. Okay, so discover means to know, articulate means to say, but it doesn't just mean to say. It means to explain even to ourselves. It means to define what it is that we believe. Part of the knowledge so generated, okay, the knowledge which was generated in this manner, that's what so generated means. Part of the knowledge so generated, knowledge which was generated in this manner, like the Bible and the Vedic scriptures, etc., is what is encapsulated in the fundamental teachings of our cultures. So part of the knowledge we have about what we really believe is to be found in the teachings of the religions of our cultures. Also, it's to be found in ancient writings, such as the Tao and the Vedic scriptures and the Bible, especially the biblical stories. Jordan Peterson loves the biblical stories. He believes they contain very ancient information about the human psyche. The Bible is, for better or worse, the foundational document of our civilization. For better or worse. We use that phrase when we are making a statement which is indisputably true, but some people will not like it. So it's true whether you like it or not. For better or worse, this is the way it is. He is assuming that some people do not want to admit that the Bible is the foundational document of Western civilization. Some people would like to throw away the Bible as a trivial book full of trivial stuff, superstitions and shallow, foolish myths, etc. However, he says, for better or worse, the Bible is the foundational document of our civilization, of Western values, Western morality, Western conceptions of good and evil. All of these people who claim to be atheists and then say, I stand for the poor, I stand for the oppressed, unlike you religious hypocrites. They're actually reaching back into biblical values for who they are, even as they throw away the Bible. It, meaning the Bible, is the product of processes that remain fundamentally beyond our comprehension. So in other words, where did we get the Bible stories? Where did they come from? Jordan Peterson believes that there is an evolution to our thought that literally is biological, that our brains have been literally shaped by the experiences of our predecessors. And also all our predecessors, those that are human and those that were non-human. So that's what he is referring to as a process beyond our comprehension. The Bible is a library, meaning it is not one book. It is a group of books composed of many books, each written and edited by many people. So it is a library of many books, and each book was written by many people and edited over centuries by many people. This is what Jordan Peterson believes the Bible is. I think some scholars, some of the books of the Bible may have been written by one person and not really edited that much. But we will not argue with this. Certainly, the oldest portion was written by many people. It's a truly, meaning the Bible, a truly emergent document, meaning bubbling up from the masses, as opposed to being written by an elite person who is imposing the thought on the masses. It's coming up from the masses. It's emergent. A selected, sequenced, and finally coherent story. All right, so selected through processes, not unlike evolution. The stories which resonated the most continued, and the stories which weren't very true fell away. So that's how they were selected. Sequenced, the simple to the more complex, giving more information. And finally coherent, after the processes of refining are complete. You get a coherent story. Coherent means it holds together. It doesn't contradict itself in a chaotic manner. Many people believe the Bible contradicts itself internally, But Jordan Peterson is saying that that is not the case. And I agree it is not. A finally coherent story written by no one and everyone. It's written by no individual person. However, it is contributed to by masses of people over many years, many thousands of years. The Bible has been thrown up out of the deep by the collective human imagination. Thrown up. Now, usually to throw up means to vomit. Oh, that's not what he means. He means it bubbled up. It ascended like Venus out of the foam. It came up out of the depth of human history by the collective human imagination, which is itself a product. So the collective human imagination is itself a product of unimaginable forces operating over unfathomable spaces of time. So the Bible is the result of something very complex and lengthy in time. And that process itself is very ancient and lengthy in time. It, again, the Bible's careful, respectful study. As I said, some people want to just throw it out lightly and not study carefully, just dismiss it. No. If you have a careful, respectful study of the Bible, it can reveal things to us about what we believe and how we do and should act. Okay, so it can reveal things to us about what we believe. This is not saying that the Bible is true. It is saying that it is an indicator of what people believe is true on a deep level in terms of how they act and live in their lives. And so it can reveal things about what we believe, and it can reveal things about how we do act, and how we should act. So this is a case where this portion, how we do act and how we should act. That is the meaning. How we do and should act. That can be discovered in almost no other way, no other manner. So the study of the Bible from a psychological point of view can reap some dividends, can give us some benefits that we will get in almost no other way. This is why Jordan Peterson teaches the Bible as a foundation for a lot of his teachings that are more contemporary. And his Bible lectures are online, freely available. They're very intellectual. They're not particularly conservative theologically, but they're very, from what I hear, interesting. Okay, so I guess we can move on, even though it's pretty late, but we'll get a little reading in the next section. Let me see where we are in this book here. Okay. Old Testament God and New Testament God. I'll get another color. I'll take red. The God of the Old Testament can appear harsh, judgmental, unpredictable, and dangerous, particularly on cursory reading. The degree to which this is true has arguably been exaggerated by Christian commentators, intent on magnifying the distinction between the older and newer divisions of the Bible. There has been a price paid, however, for such plotting, and I mean that in both senses of the word. The tendency for modern people to think, when confronted with Jehovah, quote, I would never believe in a God like that. But Old Testament God doesn't much care what modern people think. He often didn't care what Old Testament people thought either, although he could be bargained with to a surprising degree, as is particularly evident in the Abrahamic stories. Nonetheless, when his people strayed from the path, when they disobeyed his injunctions, violated his covenants, and broke his commandments, the trouble was certain to follow. If you did not do what the Old Testament God demanded, whatever that might have been and however you might have tried to hide from it, you and your children and your children's children were in terrible, serious trouble. Okay, let's read that more carefully. Old Testament God and New Testament God. Now, of course, all of you know, the Bible contains an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament is the book of the Jews. It starts with Adam and Eve and the creation of the world, and it goes all the way up almost to the birth of Jesus Christ. There is actually several hundred years of silence from God right before the birth of Jesus. In other words, no prophets and no books written. But basically, the Old Testament is everything that came before Jesus Christ. And then the New Testament begins with the birth of Jesus Christ and is the story of Jesus and the Christian church, which came about after Jesus' death and ascension into heaven. And pretty much the New Testament only was written over about 100 years, whereas the Old Testament was written over 2,000 years. Okay, so the God of the Old Testament can appear harsh, judgmental, unpredictable, and dangerous, particularly on cursory reading. Okay, so appear and cursory reading. Both of those words suggest that Jordan Peterson does not believe really that the Old Testament God is harsh, judgmental, unpredictable, and dangerous, compared maybe to New Testament God, but that this is the appearance. This is what it looks like on cursory reading if you don't read deeply. Okay, so the degree to which this is true, so the degree to which God appears harsh and judgmental in the Old Testament has, arguably, has been exaggerated by Christian commentators, intent on magnifying the distinction between the older and newer divisions of the Bible. So arguably, meaning this is not a fact, that Christian commentators exaggerate the difference between God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament in order to highlight the character of God in the New Testament. Personally, I haven't really experienced Christian commentators doing that. My personal experience is that Christian teachers show the continuity of God from the beginning of the Old Testament to the end of the New Testament. My own conception is that God's nature is completely consistent over both testaments and that there is no difference. That's my impression. That is also what I've been taught. That the only difference, or put it this way, what accounts for some difference in behavior of God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament is mainly a situation difference. In the Old Testament, you had a situation of estrangement and separation between God and man. So God appears angry all the time because man is under judgment. But in the New Testament, Jesus has brought God and man together. And so God is no longer angry because we are reconciled. So it's a situational difference, not a different God. So personally, I don't really agree that Christian commentators exaggerate the difference between the two gods. However, he uses the term arguably, which means even he is not asserting it too strongly. Intent on, magnifying. That means their reason for exaggerating would be to magnify the character of God in the New Testament. In other words, their motive is to highlight the goodness of God in the New Testament. There has been a price paid, however, for such plotting. Okay, so plotting has two meanings. If a man is writing a book and he decides what will happen in the book, first a man will be killed, and then the crime will be concealed, and then the detective will search, and then the detective will discover the truth, and then the truth will come out. This is called plotting. He is creating a plot for a book. It is setting the events and the characters and the story of a book. That's one definition of plotting. And so it's saying plotting the Bible so that God is one way in the Old Testament and a different way in the New Testament would be a very intentional way of messing with the Bible. So plotting. And then plotting also means to conspire to do evil with a group of people. So we together are speaking to each other to decide how to do a bad thing. So plotting as in setting the story, and plotting as in getting together to deceive people. Those are the two ways he's using the word. So there has been a price paid, however, for such plotting. In other words, for deciding you're going to exaggerate the harshness of God in the old and the kindness of God in the new. And what is the price paid? We have a colon here, which means the price we have paid, or the consequences that we bear, are the tendency for modern people to think, when confronted with Jehovah, which is Old Testament God is Jehovah, they think, I would never believe in a God like that. So, any Christian who wants to bring people to God should not tamper with the story. They should not change the plot of the Bible. They should not plot to exaggerate something, because it has a bad effect. The hearers might say, I would never believe in a God like that, which is the opposite of what the Christian commentator wanted. They wanted the person to be so attracted to New Testament God that they would give their heart to Jesus. But instead, they were so repelled by Old Testament God that they rejected him. Okay, so, but, and in the past, Old Testament God is very harsh, but Old Testament God doesn't much care what people think. Okay, so this isn't quite that, but he often didn't care what Old Testament people thought either. So God himself doesn't care what we think, although he could be bargained with to a surprising degree, as is particularly evident in the Abrahamic stories. So Old Testament God doesn't care what people think today, didn't care what people thought then, but he was surprisingly interactive. If I had more time, I would tell you the story of Abraham that he's talking about here. But anyway, it had to do, the one I'm thinking of is the destruction of Sodom, where Abraham's nephew Lot was living. So you can look that up. Nonetheless, when his people strayed from the path, when they disobeyed his injunctions and violated his covenants and broke his commandments, the trouble was certain to follow. Okay, so he was interactive with them, he listened, he would bargain with them, but if they were bad and disobeyed his law, they were punished by God, inevitably. If you didn't do what Old Testament God demanded, whatever that might have been, so whatever he demands, and however you might have tried to hide it, so you disobeyed but nobody caught you, doesn't matter. You and your children and your grandchildren were in terrible, serious trouble. Okay, so we are out of time, or I would be telling you stories from the Bible of how this happened. And it is true that it's very remarkable, the punishments given by God to whole families of people, whole groups of people, because of the sins of just one, maybe a father or something. Well, we'll have to pick it up next week. See you later.